1 Corinthians 9:19, Paul talked about the idea being the goal is to win more of them. You're here hopefully because you're interested in soul winning. I mean, that should be the bottom line. And from our perspective as a university, and that's faculty and staff and all of us who are here, what we want for you is we want you to enjoy huge success. We want you to leave here and we want you to have a hugely successful career in ministry. Some of our students who are online are already in ministry in their continuing education. That's what we want from you. And the last thing we ever want to see happen is for somebody to get done and then have problems that could have been prevented. We don't want to see, and we talked about it last week, we don't want to see your investment in being a student and the investment that others make in you. We don't want to see that investment not pay off because that would be bad stewardship of the Lord's money. And so we want to see you be successful. So, some things about thinking professionally first. I hope you understand we're talking about you're thinking professionally, and that it better translate into action. You know, thoughts with no action, kind of worthless. So we're talking in terms of how are you going to act professionally? Are you going to be a professional? Are you going to approach this in the right way? Remember that you are in business for yourself. The IRS is even going to classify you as being self-employed when you get out of here. In other words, I want you to think in terms of nobody's going to care more about your business and your ministry than you do. And so you've got a brand to protect, you've got a reputation to protect because you are running your own business in a sense. And so you need to think about it that way. So I want to talk about honing your craft, your preaching skills, your people skills. I want to talk a little bit about the impression that you make on people. I want to talk a little bit about your reputation online, and actually we could do an entire chapel on that, just your reputation online, and then conclude by talking about being recommendable now. But as far as honing your craft is preaching, your craft is ministry, your craft is relating to people, and so as such, it ought to be a craft that you work on for a lifetime trying to improve. And so first thing I'd talk about is goals. Do you have any goals for your ministry? And right now you're thinking, my goal right now is to get my diploma, and that's a worthy goal. And I hope you've written that goal down. I want to get done, and hopefully you put a date on it, because if you put a date on the idea that I want to graduate by a certain date, it'll help that come to fruition. So, but beyond that, if you're already in ministry, do you have some goals written down, maybe about the number of Bible studies that you want to do with people, number of conversions you'd like to see happen in your ministry? You may have some goals about, well, I'm at a congregation right now, but in 5 years I want to be in a larger congregation. There's nothing wrong with wanting to advance yourself. Maybe there's certain areas where you'd like to work, and maybe you've got some financial goals. And you know, sometimes we're like maybe not supposed to say that out loud related to ministry, but it's okay to have some goals financially as well. So in regard to those things, I want to talk about your ability to effectively work with people. Because while you're here, you're going to learn a great deal about ministering to people, and you're going to learn a lot about maybe counseling people and helping them with their problems, but you may not learn quite as much about working with people as you're going to need out there in the real world. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves." You need an element of wisdom, because the only problem you're really going to have is the idea that we have to deal with people. If it weren't for people, we'd hardly ever have trouble. And sometimes that's our own, and sometimes it's the makings of others. But I'd ask you this: what kind of ministry do you want? You know, do you want to work 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years with a single congregation? Because there are men out there who've done that. Men like Ken Joins over in the Memphis area. He works with a congregation that goes through a major transition, a major move, and works with them and retires there, and they send him on a cruise, and he's still a member there, and they love him, and he loves that church. Robert Oglesby. And many of you love that man because of what that man has meant to preacher training, because Robert and his foundation some of you are receiving scholarships from him. Well, the reason he's able to do that is because he's had this long-term, almost 50-year ministry with one church. And so do you want a ministry like that, or do you want that one where it's every 2 or 3 years I'm moving because of relationships with brethren that go sour, or people that won't accept me, or, you can fill in any reason. But what I've seen with the 2 and 3 year cycle is that a lot of times those guys are leaving, and there are always these bridges that are on fire behind them. And that's not a good thing. So, capable evangelists often don't get to enjoy long-term ministries. And capable evangelists, they often have been, they often are getting mistreated. You're going to be mistreated at some point. Robert Oglesby's been mistreated at some point. Ken Jones was mistreated at some point. But the difference is, are we going to realize that our work in ministry, our work anywhere really, is learning about the fact that we have to deal with people the way they are and not the way they ought to be. And when you just realize that, and you realize that I've got to look for the good in people who may sometimes not, they don't seem to have a whole lot of good in them, when you realize you've got to work with people, that will help you be successful. And you can remember this, if Christians had it all together, a lot of the preaching we do would not be needed. And so, just things to keep in mind. Another complicating factor related to people skills, that's not what your college curriculum's about. Some of it is, but by and large it's about academics. And so it leaves you with that, I've got to go fill this void. I've got to make sure that I learn the people skills that I need if I'm going to be successful in ministry. Because things like that, Travis has a phrase about don't blow up the dynamite shed. Sometimes you can see a situation and you can approach a situation and you can choose to be selfish and you can just watch the whole thing go boom because you wanted your way. But sometimes working with people means that I'm not going to blow the dynamite shed up. It may help you have a well thought out exit strategy. A friend of mine told me a few weeks ago, he said, well, I've been thinking about resigning for a while. I went ahead and did it because I thought that would get me motivated to look for my next job. It's okay to laugh because that statement is crazy. Travis calls that one shopping for a parachute on the way down. That's not wise. I may need to plan an exit strategy at some point. And so the better job we do of working with people, it will help us avoid burning bridges. And that should always be the goal, because if I burn bridges, I don't win, church doesn't win, church leadership doesn't win. And in ministry, what we always need to be looking for are win-win-win situations where it's good for me, it's good for the church, it's good for the church leadership. And when we'll approach ministry that way, that's when more good things happen for the kingdom. So I would challenge you to become a student of human engineering, the idea of how do I work with people. That means you're going to have to go read some things and study some things and study some people. President Jones will often say that school's never out for a leader, and as a minister, you're a leader. You're a leader. Have you found a mentor yet? Or, for lack of a better term, do you find some other people in ministry from whom you can learn? Because sometimes I may think I've got all the answers, and hopefully at some point I realize that I don't. But you may have the privilege of, maybe you go to work in a place like Hamilton and you go to work with a man like Ted Burleson, and he's sitting in there and he's been in ministry for years and he's got all this experience. Or maybe you're working with a Bill Bagents, and so as the younger guy in the room and on the team, do you realize the value that you have there, and do you begin to try to form the relationship that will allow you to be a sponge and just learn as much as you can about ministry and avoid mistakes because you've got somebody that you're working with who's got a lot more experience than you do? I learned a lot that way. I learned a lot about communication skills. A lot of times you've got to over-communicate. You've got to say it and say it and say it and say it. And sometimes you've got to go out of your way. You may have a deacon that you just have to go out of your way to work with that person to get things done, and you may have to do more paperwork than you want to do, and you may have to have more conversations than you want to have, but there's value in that if the work gets done in the end. And I learned a lot about that from a mentor type person. Also never forget the idea of service. Jesus came here as a servant. He talks about that over and over. He lives it out over and over. I always try to operate, if I'm going to think professionally, I've got to operate with a servant's heart. I heard a preacher say this a few weeks ago, and it really made an impact on me, but he said a servant does not talk about what he does not have to do. I don't have to do that. A servant doesn't talk that way, because a servant is there to do whatever he can. Focus on elevating your public speaking and your presentation skills. Use your electives wisely here. Make sure that you're getting everything you can about learning how to take the knowledge that you've gained and then share it with people. Because you can know a lot and people really don't care how much you know, but they will care if you're not able to effectively communicate what you know to them. That will make an impact on them. And so learn by using your electives wisely. Study public speakers. There was a major speech given within the last couple of weeks by Bill Clinton. I didn't agree with Bill Clinton. But if you're going to be a public speaker, you ought to study his ability to speak, because the man can move people. He could easily be re-elected probably tomorrow if we could elect for a third term, because of his ability to connect with people when he gets up and has something to say. He always does well speaking. So you can learn from people that you don't even necessarily agree with from an ideological standpoint. Be an avid reader. There are a lot of books about how to speak and how to do well. And then put in adequate study time. And we were receiving some feedback from a key person. And fortunately, these notes were written long enough ago. I don't remember who said it, and I don't remember who they were talking about. And I'm really happy, because the feedback we received were, the lessons are a little short and they don't seem well prepared. As a public speaker, as a preacher, that's not the feedback we need from our congregations, from the people who are there for us. First impressions, and I'm moving quickly. I'm trying to get through as much of this as I can. In my work, I make a lot of first impressions because I have to visit a lot of churches, and so I may be there 30 minutes before I'm ever in the pulpit to say a word, and by the time I get up to speak, a lot of first impressions have already been formed. And it happens from the time you get out of the car to the time you come in the building. And what kind of first impression are you going to make on people in your ministry? Are you going to look like a preacher? Are you going to carry yourself like a preacher? Are you going to walk with a pace that says, what I'm doing is important? Some people walk like they don't care if they ever get to where they're going, and maybe they don't. But if you're a preacher, and if you're a leader, and if you are trying to help people be moved from where they are closer to a right relationship with God, that ought to put something in the way you move from place to place and in the way you present yourself to people. It's very important. And I've got a lot more here that I could say than I've got time to say. But don't do anything to make a negative first impression if you can avoid it. Very proud of one of our guys who preaches in another state right now, but he got very concerned about his weight, and he's lost over 100 pounds. And one of the things that he talked about as he has lost this weight, he said, it has helped my preaching. And it's hard to argue with somebody that's been through it. And I don't know exactly what caused him. It may have just been the idea that he wants to be more healthy. I had a search committee member from a church say this to me not too long ago. He was talking about some of the candidates that they were looking at, and he said one guy, he said his preaching was pretty good, but he was just way overweight. And he said, the first thing I thought was, it just looks like he's lazy in the way he's presenting himself. And so, again, we can do whatever we want to do, and his perception may have been completely false. But what we want to do is we want to minimize anything in our ministry that would help us be effective in preaching and teaching and reaching the lost. Practical suggestions for some of these things about first impressions. And by the way, you may be thinking, well, I'm going to preach in one congregation. I won't make first impressions. If the church is doing what the church is supposed to do, you'd better be making first impressions every Sunday. Because if the church is reaching out, you ought to have people there on a regular basis, and it's the first time they will have seen you. It's the first time they will have heard you preach. And so you should be making first impressions. Be on time, your appearance, do you carry yourself like you care? We don't have time to talk about clothing today, so we won't. I want to spend a minute or two on regarding your online reputation. What are you doing to establish and protect your, for lack of a better word, your brand online? Because there are a lot of crazy things that end up on the internet. And a lot of times we end up in the middle of some of those crazy things, and sometimes they're probably not good for our ministry. And a while back, youth ministers interviewing for a job. It's the point of the interview where the elders want to interview not only the youth minister but his wife. And so they walk into the interview, and one of the elders has wife's Facebook profile all printed out right there in the interview. That's your real resume. Do you know that? That's really who you are. I mean, the resume we print up and send out, that's what we want people to think. That's what we want people to know. But if somebody can have access to your real resume, that's what they really want to know. Who is this person? And this young lady was taken a bit aback by that. But, you know, that's life. And so we need to be protecting our online brand. There is great value in pausing before you hit send or before you hit post. You know, because sometimes we'll type something up and we're in a rage and we're in a huff, but once you commit that to cyberspace, it's a permanent record. And sometimes there's great value. You type it up, but man, I may want to sleep on that, or I may want my friend Travis, who will give me honest feedback. Do I really need to send this? Or, you know, I maybe just need to write it, get it out of my system, and never send it to anybody. But sometimes some of these online theological debates that go back and forth, and somebody will raise a question, well, I've got to throw my 2 cents in there, and so I get involved, and then somebody else gets involved, and before long, what are you really trying to accomplish? Yeah, am I really trying to help somebody be closer to God, or am I really just trying to make sure that everybody understands what I think? Because sometimes I don't know that some of the online back and forth things that we end up in are really valuable to the kingdom, and I don't know that they're really valuable to us as professionals. The last thing, and then we'll get to the Constitution video, do what you can to be recommendable while you're here in school. If you're still in here with us, and I know some are already out in ministry and those kinds of things, but one of the key aspects of learning to think and act professionally is to go ahead and start thinking about these things while you're a student. Human nature is this: if I hurt you, you'll never forget it. If I do some good things for you, you may remember them for a while, but the hurt is what's always easier to remember. And if you do crazy things while you're here, unfortunately, for all of us who are here, those are the things that are hardest to forget and easiest to remember. And we want to be able to make great recommendations on you when you leave here. Because again, we want you to be successful in ministry. So do everything you can to be recommendable. Have that servant's heart. Go out of your way to do what you can. Turn your things in on time. Don't always be groveling with your instructors, begging for mercy. Just get it done. Just get it done. And if you do that, then things will go better. I remember we got a call about a former person who had gone here years ago, and the only recommendation that the person could give was steer clear of that guy. And there's no need in that. If you do your work and be the kind of person that you are going to try to help others be as you preach and teach, man, everything will go great in your ministry. Think and act professionally.